This is a three-part seminar about advanced techniques in bass fishing, specifically fishing the stickbait. John Blank is a Bass Pro Angler and one of my associate guides. John gave this seminar at Cabela's in Tulalip, Washington, and is packed with great information about fishing stickbaits a variety of ways. In part 1, John will talk about the equipment you need for successful stickbait fishing.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Blank, tournament angler throughout the Northwest. And what I'm going to talk to you today is about some advanced techniques for bass fishing. I'm really going to dive into all the different ways you can fish a stickbait today. And it's probably definitely a go-to lure that everybody should have in their tackle box. So first off, I'll talk about rod and reel selection. So what kind of rod and reel that you should have for throwing a stickbait effectively. It'll work on anything, but really setting it up to the right specific rod and reel setup, you'll have better success. Talk about line selection. You know, a lot of folks in the Northwest, bass is a secondary. So they're using their trout rod and then, you know, they hook into bass and they kind of get excited about that. If I could steer you to buy a bass rod first and then fish trout with it, you'll probably have a little better success. Your bass rod generally has a little more power down low. I'll talk to that, and then matching it up with the right line selection. So techniques for the stickbait that I'll talk about and walk you guys all through is fishing it weightless. It's probably one of the most popular techniques there is, but there's lots of little nuances that you could do to this weight to give it a different look. There's wacky style. Great technique. It's one that I use all the time, especially when I'm skip casting docks and getting that worm down into areas where I normally couldn't cast to. Just like a kid when you're skipping rocks, you're going to skip that bait under the dock so you can get back another 5 to 7 feet where those fish are hiding out. Going to talk about Texas rig. Not a lot of people Texas rig a stickbait, but it is very effective, especially when I show you a couple little techniques that we could do with the bait. And then I'm going to talk about drop shotting. You know, and drop shotting is it's a vertical technique. Generally, you're using your electronics to target your bass and using that stickbait for that. So let's look at rod selection. A medium to a medium heavy rod is ideal. This is a 7-footer. I use the Legend Tournament Series through St. Croix. They have the Mojo Bass Series that works very good. But you want a medium power, so you're getting the power here to set the hook, and then a fast action up front. So you still got the rod that'll give up here, but what you got to keep in mind when you're bass fishing compared to trout, compared to steelhead, is a lot of times your hook is embedded in the plastic. Not only that, a bass has a much harder mouth than a trout or a salmon. So you need the additional power in your rod when you're setting the hook to drive that hook home into the fish's mouth. And you know, you guys have all seen the bass guys on the tournament trail and they hook in a fish and man, they're swinging for the fences when they're setting the hook. And it's because they're going through the plastic and they're trying to get through that hard mouth plate to get that hook buried where they hang on to the fish. So right rod for the situation definitely is ideal for getting that hook set. Like I said, Mojo Bass rods, they're a good introductory level rod for around $100, very sensitive. I fish the Legend Tournament Series, which, you know, they average $250 to $280. If I have them side by side as far as sensitivity and feel, not much difference. So really it's a pretty good value, and there are times where I do use the Mojo series as well. And then for the techniques today, throwing the worm, you definitely want a graphite rod is ideal. It's going to be a little more sensitive, it's going to be a little stronger versus a fiberglass rod. When I really look at fiberglass rod, really the only time they come into play is when you're throwing crankbaits, because it's going to be a little more forgiving rod so you don't rip those treble hooks out of the fish's mouth. But graphite definitely is preferred. So in your spinning reel selection, taking a look at reels, a medium spinning reel is ideal. Something like this, you don't want an ultralight. Bass are super strong. And the reason why you want to fish with that medium power is you want to put the pressure on the fish. A lot of times they're around cover. They'll get you wrapped around a dock or they get down into brush. You want a strong enough drag to get that fish out and get them to where you can play them in open water. If you have a really light reel, it's hard to do. And then if you get too small of a spool as you get downsized on it, what I find, especially when you're fishing weightless in these wacky, you'll get a lot of line twists. So I'll talk a little bit about some techniques to avoid getting those line twists when you're fishing weightless. It happens, but if you don't pay attention to what you're doing, you'll be part of the problem that'll do it. A 10-pound drag, again, having that drag, a good drag. Spend the money for a decent reel. I personally use the Flugers. But any reel in the $79 and up range is a good introductory reel to get into. That's going to perform pretty well and have the drag that you need to fight those fish. And then when you look at how many yards of line, 185 is kind of what I gauge as about the right spool size. Anywhere in there. Doesn't mean I put on 185 yards of fluorocarbon because it's expensive. I'll back it with mono and put on 100 yards of fluorocarbon so I can make that the most cost effective there. When you look at a casting reel, if I'm going to fish with a casting setup, and there are certain techniques that work better that I find. When I fish wacky rig, I like to use my spinning rod setup because I have more control and I can skip under the docks a lot easier without getting backlashes into my bait casting reel. But that said, if I'm over at the potholes, or I'm fishing Goodwin, or I'm in Whatcom, or on Lake Washington throwing a full-size Senko, I like to use my bait casting reel and rod. So what you're looking for there is, I prefer a low profile. And if you look at a lot of the new bait casting reels, you can see you get that low profile that comes down in. And what that allows you, it allows you to really palm it in your hand and hold it here. And it gives you more control over the rod as you work through the techniques. Now this really comes into play when you're working structure on the bottom. Not so much if your lure's just sinking down like a stick bait, but when it comes to technique specific and you're twitching and every little movement counts, especially when you got that rod in your hand for 10, 11 hours like we do out tournament fishing, having the ergonomics that fits really nice into one package makes it a lot easier. When you look at retrieve rates, and for this technique specific, I use a 6-4 to 1 to 7 1 to 1. There's 8 1 to 1s out there now where you get a bigger line retrieve in quicker. And when you look at fishing with stick baits, you want generally a higher retrieve so you can get control of that fish faster. We talked about that medium power rod with the fast action tip, so I can control that fish, get him out of the cover, get him into the open water where I can work with the fish and get it to the boat. So that's why the retrieve rate is important there. This is the Aura from Abu Garcia. It's a mid-level, good components. You got adjustability from the initial cast all the way to where it hits the water. As it blows and I come into different weather patterns, I can adjust this so I'm not getting backlashes. But anything, whether it's our Abu Garcia, Daiwa, Shimano, anything in that price range is going to give you overall a pretty good presentation for bass fishing and work for most techniques that you'll need. And then with any bait casting reel, you want, I think, in my opinion, a 15-pound drag minimum, because there's times where you're really going to have to put pressure on that fish. They get wrapped up, and the stronger drag system you have is much better. Line selection. For my spinning rods, generally I use an 8 to 10 pound test. Line is ideal. For me, it seems to lay on the spool very well, performs throughout most techniques. When I'm fishing the weightless worm, I'm using fluorocarbon line because it's ultra clear. I can fish a little heavier line. It's going to be abrasion resistant. And there's one more property to fluorocarbon that's probably the most valuable when it comes to fishing the stick baits, is it sinks. So it's going to be a sinking line that's going to follow down versus sitting on the top of the water. Now, how many here have you used fluorocarbon? How many of you have put it on a spinning reel and you open the bail and it's just jumping off of there? You just spool up, you go to cast, and your lure hits the water, and then it's like, okay, there's 5, 10, 15 yards, and you think, I just spent $20 to put line on this reel, and now I just got a big mess. Okay, fluorocarbon is very finicky, but what I've found, and I'm a firm believer of it now, and I'll show you what I use, is line conditioner. How many of you guys use line conditioner? Okay, so when it comes to mono or copolymer, the Real Magic works really well. I put it on initially when I spool, and then after I fish every couple times, I spray it on. Keeps my line working really, really well. And I'll set that up there so you can see it. However, that is not made for fluorocarbon. KVD makes a lure line conditioner that is made for fluorocarbon, and it will tame your line and make, whether you're using a spinning rod or a bait casting rod, treat your line with this when you put it on the spool, and then every few times when you use it, spray it around and keep it on there, and it takes the spring out of it and lets it lay much better on the spool. So I am, like I said, a huge fan of line conditioner. Now, how many, when you're using a spinning rod, and I get a lot of people, especially when they're fishing a wacky rig or they're fishing a Senko, they say, God, I get line twists in my line all the time and I'm fighting it. You ever been there after fishing with it all day? There's one technique I want you to be very conscientious about. So after you cast that bait out there and it hits the water, the Senko takes a long time to get down. So you generally have a lot of slack line and no weight on that bait. What do most people do? They do this. And you're twisting that line up in the spinning reel. When you're fishing Senkos and you want to have a great day where you don't have to mess with your line conditioner number 1, and after you cast, you let it sink, you flip it over with your hand, grab a little of the slack here, reel up those first 2 so you get tension on it, and that'll eliminate all your line twists and all your mesh that you have. I never, ever, and I spend hours and hours and hours with the spinning reel in my hand, I never do this, ever. It's cast, then I manually bring my hand over in one fluid motion. Now it's muscle memory where I never have to think about it. So try that if you don't already do it. It'll make a huge difference how your spinning rod performs, and at the end of the day, you're going to save line because you're not going to get knots all up in it, and you're going to have a better experience out there fishing. I personally use Vicious. I'm sponsored from them, but I have used Iser line, another really good line. Cabela's doesn't carry Vicious line here. Seaguar and Vizex is probably one of the best for putting on spinning rails, and really with good properties, low stretch. And when buying line, you get what you pay for. So buy a reputable, good quality line, and then take care of it as you go through with the line conditioner. Casting reels, when I'm fishing Senkos, I'm fishing 12 to 17 pound test line. You get over in the potholes and you get around the brush, you're going to want to up your poundage a little bit. Those fish get down in there and you go to set the hook and your fish will be gone. Around here, 12 pounds plenty around docks and rocks. You won't have any challenges there. But again, fluorocarbon, that's my go-to. Anytime I'm doing underwater, nothing on top water, of course, because that sinking line would take away from the action of the topwater bait. But anytime I'm going down, whether it's Texas rig, jig fishing, crankbait, I go with fluorocarbon, less stretch, better sensitivity, and less visible than the mono or copolymer. And again, use line conditioner. I usually take it and put it on a rag, spray it on a rag as I spool, and let the line go through there, and then hit the reel, and then let it sit. Give it one more shot in the morning, and you're good to go. And then from there, as you see the memory start to take place, just spray it with line conditioner again, and you'll be...
That wraps it up for part 1. Make sure you move on to part 2, where John will talk about rigging and fishing the stick bait weightless and wacky style.